The hatchery manager didn't even look up from his clipboard when he gave the order. "Toss 'em," he said, flicking his wrist toward a wooden pallet stacked with 320 heritage turkey eggs. "They're past sell-by. Nobody wants old eggs. Landfill runs Tuesday." A woman standing nearby stared at that pallet. Her boots were cracked at the toe. Her truck had 214,000 miles on it. She had $11 in her checking account and a farm that was 60 days from foreclosure. She looked at those eggs like they were the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. "I'll take them," Claire Whitlock said quietly. The manager finally looked up. Then he laughed, a short, ugly sound that bounced off the metal walls. "Lady, those eggs are garbage." "Then you won't mind if I take your garbage. If this story moves something in you, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will absolutely floor you. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you believe in people who refuse to quit, hit that like button before we go any further. Stay with me until the very end. You do not want to miss what those eggs became." The morning Claire Whitlock drove out to Garrison Valley Hatchery, she told herself she was only going to price chicks. That was the plan. A simple plan. The kind of plan a person makes when they are trying very hard to feel like they still have options. She had been making those kinds of plans a lot lately. She drove with the windows down because the truck's AC compressor had seized up in July, and it was now the second week of August, and the heat across the high plains of central Montana sat on everything like a wet wool blanket that had been left in the sun. The radio worked on one station, which played country music from 1987 on a loop, and she didn't change it because she liked the familiar noise. It kept her from thinking too hard about numbers. The numbers were bad. 2 seasons back, a late frost had killed her alfalfa crop just as it came in. She'd borrowed against the property to buy replacement feed for the sheep. Then last season, the grasshoppers came. Not a few. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands. They moved across her south pastures like a brown wave, and when they left, there was almost nothing. The sheep got skinny. The lambs didn't gain weight the way they should have. She sent 30 to market in October, and the check she received covered maybe 4 weeks of operating costs. Her father's farm. Her grandfather's farm before that. 83 years of Whitlocks working the same piece of Montana hardpan, and she was the one who was going to lose it. She tried not to think about that either. The hatchery sat at the end of a long gravel road off Highway 12, a cluster of low metal buildings that smelled like warm feathers and feed grain from half a mile out. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Garrison Valley Hatchery. Quality poultry since 1961. The paint was peeling on the 6 and the 1. Claire parked between a grain truck and a battered pickup with a Livestock Association sticker in the window, and she went inside. The front office was small and smelled like coffee that had been warming on a burner since approximately 1994. A teenage boy behind the counter looked up from his phone long enough to point her toward the back when she asked about chick pricing, and she went through a swinging door into the operations floor. It hit her. The noise first. Hundreds of birds peeping in plastic trays under heat lamps, the air thick and warm and close. A fan the size of a helicopter blade turning slowly in the ceiling. And there, near the far wall, a man with a clipboard and a sour expression walking slowly around a wooden pallet. His name was Dale Richter. She knew who he was the way you know everyone who runs a business in a county with 12,000 people, by reputation and rumor. Richter had been running the hatchery since he bought it from the original owners in 2009, and the general understanding in the valley was that Dale Richter was good at making money and not particularly interested in anything else. He was talking to one of his workers, a young man in rubber boots who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. "How old are they?" Richter was saying. 26, 27 days on most of them. Few might be 28. Richter made a sound in the back of his throat like a drain clearing. "Nobody's buying 26-day heritage eggs. We already marked them down twice. We got 60 new orders coming in from the commercial guys next week, and I need this floor space." He clicked his pen. "Landfill runs Tuesday. Put 'em on the list." The worker said, "Yes, sir," and started to move away. Claire had stopped walking. She was looking at the pallet. It was stacked maybe 4 feet high with egg cartons, the biodegradable kind, brown and plain. She could see the careful handwriting on the sides. Bronze-breasted heritage turkey. She'd grown up knowing about heritage turkeys, the old breeds, the ones that actually foraged, that took time to mature, that tasted like something real. Her grandmother had kept a small flock of them when Claire was young. She remembered following them through the tall grass as a little girl, watching them hunt and scratch and move through the farm like they owned it. 320 eggs. She didn't even know she was going to speak until the words were already out. "Excuse me, are those going to waste?" Richter turned around. He looked at her the way people sometimes look at something that has wandered into the wrong place. Not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of impatient bewilderment. "They're past sell-by," he said. 26, 28 days. Commercial operations want day-old eggs or fresh set. Nobody incubates this late in the cycle. Hatch rates go to garbage after day 21 on a good day. "But they're fertile?" He blinked. "Well, yeah, they were fertile when we set them. Whether they're still viable after sitting at the wrong temperature for the past 3 days while we figured out what to do with them." He shrugged. "Who knows? Probably not many. Maybe none." "Can I have them?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room decides whether to take something seriously or not. The worker in the rubber boots looked up. 2 women sorting chicks at a table nearby glanced over. Richter stared at her for a moment with his clipboard pressed to his chest. Then he laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine surprise mixed with a little bit of pity and a little bit of contempt. A dismissive sound. A you can't be serious sound. "Lady," he said, "those eggs are garbage. That's 300 eggs that are probably already dead inside. You'd need an incubator the size of a barn. You'd need to keep temperature and humidity perfect for another, 2 more weeks, if any of them even have a viable embryo left. You're looking at a 0% return on your time and trouble." Claire said, "Can I have them or not?" It wasn't a question the second time. Her voice was flat and quiet, and she kept her eyes on Richter, and she did not look away. He studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not respect, not quite, but a recalculation. "You serious?" "I'm parked out front. I've got a truck with a covered bed. I'll take every one of them today so you don't have to haul them Tuesday." Richter looked at the pallet, looked back at her. He shrugged, a gesture that said clearly that whatever happened next was entirely her problem and none of his. "Sign a release at the front desk. No refunds, no guarantees, no liability on our end if you hatch 1,200 dead birds or burn your barn down trying." "Fine. And you're hauling them yourself. I'm not loading them." "I didn't ask you to." She signed the release. She loaded 320 egg cartons by herself, 2 cartons at a time in the August heat, with the hatchery workers watching from the open bay door and saying nothing helpful. It took her 40 minutes. Her shirt was soaked through by the time she got the last carton settled and covered with the tarp she kept in the truck bed. She drove home with her hands steady on the wheel and her jaw tight. She wasn't sure if she'd just made the most desperate decision of her life or the most stupid one. Maybe both. She was too tired to tell the difference. Her brother Elias was sitting on the porch steps when she pulled in, eating a peanut butter sandwich and reading something on his phone. He was 29, 8 years younger than Claire, with their father's long face and their mother's tendency to look at difficult situations with a kind of cheerful pragmatism that occasionally drove Claire absolutely insane. He watched her pull the truck around to the old equipment barn. He finished his sandwich. He walked over. "What's in the truck?" he said. "Eggs." He lifted the edge of the tarp and looked. Then he let the tarp fall back and looked at Claire. "There are a lot of eggs in this truck." 320. "Turkey eggs. Heritage bronze." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Claire, we don't have a turkey operation." "We might. We don't have an incubator. We have the old dairy barn." Another pause. She could see him working through it, the way he always did, quietly and methodically, turning a thing over in his mind before he said anything about it. That was one thing she genuinely respected about her brother. He didn't panic out loud. "Those eggs are how old, Tuktab?" he said. 26 to 28 days, maybe a few at 29. Standard heritage turkey incubation is 28 days. "I know." "Claire." He looked at the truck. He looked at her. Some of these might already be past hatch point. Some of them might have died in transit or when the hatchery dropped the temperature. Some of them might never have been viable at all. You could be looking at a 0. "Or I could be looking at 200 turkeys," she said. "And if I am, they'll be free-range heritage birds and I can sell them for Thanksgiving at $40, $50 a bird." Or I can keep the hens and build a breeding flock. Or... She stopped. She took a breath. Or I could be looking at a zero. I know. I know what the downside is, Elias. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. All right, he said. What do you need me to do? What she needed him to do was help her turn the old dairy barn into something that could function as a giant incubation room, and she needed it done before sundown. The barn was structurally solid. Her grandfather had built it in 1958 with Douglas fir framing and corrugated metal siding, and it had outlasted 3 generations of weather and neglect with only minor complaints. The milking equipment had been gone since 1999. For the past 12 years, it had held a tractor, 3 hay forks, various things without names that she kept meaning to throw away, and a smell of old wood and motor oil that Claire had always secretly loved. They cleared it in 2 hours. They swept the concrete floor. They dug out the 2 old space heaters from the storage shed and tested them. One worked fine, one sparked, and made a sound like a small animal objecting, so they set it aside. They found a 3rd heater at the back of the barn that turned out to be perfectly functional, and had apparently been sitting under a canvas drop cloth since the second Bush administration. Temperature, Claire said, consulting the notes she'd pulled up on her phone. Heritage turkey eggs need 99 to 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit through the incubation period, humidity around 55%. We need to turn them manually 3 times a day if we don't have auto-turners. We don't have auto-turners, Elias said. No. So we're turning 320 eggs 3 times a day. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. Okay, and what's our thermometer situation? She held up a digital probe thermometer she'd found in the kitchen drawer. The battery cover was held on with electrical tape. Elias stared at it. That's what we're using. I'm going to get her back up tomorrow. Claire. Elias. He pressed his lips together. Okay. Let's set up the egg trays. They used wooden pallets with wire mesh across the top to create raised flat surfaces, and they set the cartons in rows with the narrow end down, the way her phone told her to. They arranged the 3 heaters to distribute heat as evenly as possible across the space. They hung a humidity gauge Elias found at the hardware store when he drove to town for supplies. 3 thermometers, 2 more humidity gauges, a case of WD-40, and a bag of dried pasta, because he said they needed to eat, and he didn't want to hear about it. By 9 o'clock that night, the barn was holding at 98.8 degrees. Close enough for now. Claire sat on a folding chair in the middle of the barn, sweating in the heat, surrounded by 320 eggs she'd taken from a landfill pile, and she thought about her grandfather. She thought about the way he used to say that every farm has a season where the margin between making it and losing it is about as wide as a knife blade, and the only thing that determines which side you fall on is whether you're willing to keep showing up. She'd always thought that was a comforting thing to say. Sitting in that barn, she thought it sounded like a threat. Yeah, the first person to hear about the eggs was Nora Kessel, who ran the feed supply 3 miles down the road, and who had known Claire since they were both in 4th grade together. Nora heard it from Elias, who stopped in for chicken grit the next morning and mentioned it in passing. By afternoon, Nora had told her husband Tom, who told his brother Ray, who worked part-time at the Garrison Valley Hatchery and recognized the story immediately. By Thursday evening, Claire's phone had 2 voicemails. The first was from Dale Richter. Miss Whitlock, this is Dale over at the hatchery. I heard you've got those surplus eggs set up for incubation over at your place. I want to be clear that I signed off on that transaction in good faith, and I wish you luck. I truly do. But I want to make sure you understand the release you signed covers us completely when this doesn't work out. Not trying to be negative, just wanted to be clear. All right, good luck. The second was from a man named Gerald Pruitt, who ran the largest sheep operation in the county, and who Claire had known her whole life as someone who had strong opinions about the correct way to do everything. Claire. Gerald Pruitt. I heard about the eggs. I want you to know that I think it's admirable that you're trying to make something out of nothing. I really do. But I've got to tell you honestly, as someone who's been farming this land for 40 years, heritage turkey incubation is a complicated business under ideal conditions. And what you're describing is about as far from ideal conditions as you can get. I'm not saying this to be discouraging. I'm saying it because I think you should be prepared for disappointment and maybe consider what your next move is going to be when this doesn't work out. Give me a call sometime We can talk about options. Claire deleted both voicemails and went back to the barn to turn the eggs. 3 days in, she found the first dead one. She was doing the morning turn, moving carefully down the rows, rotating each egg 180 degrees the way the instructions said, when she picked up one near the far corner and felt immediately that something was wrong. It was too light, too quiet. When she held it up to the flashlight, no candle, she wasn't going to risk an open flame near 300 eggs in a wooden barn. The interior showed none of the dark silhouette of a developing embryo. Just light passing through, diffuse and even. Clear egg. Dead before she'd ever gotten to it, or never fertile at all. She set it aside and kept moving. By the end of the morning turn, she had 11 clear eggs set aside in a separate box. 11 out of 320 isn't bad, Elias said, looking at the box. It's the ones I can check, she said. The ones that are harder to candle, I don't know. Could be 20, could be 50, could be 5. Yeah. She set down the flashlight. Could be 5. She stood there in the barn heat, and she thought about Gerald Pruitt's voice on her phone, that measured, careful, this is for your own good tone she'd been hearing from various men her entire farming life, whenever she tried to do something they hadn't thought of first. Something tightened in her chest that she recognized as anger, and she was grateful for it. Anger was useful. Anger kept you turning eggs at 5 in the morning, and again at noon, and again at 9 at night when your back hurt, and the thermometer kept reading 98.3 instead of 99, and you couldn't figure out why. She turned the next egg, and the next one. On day 5, Elias candled a batch of 20 eggs from the middle section and came to find her at the kitchen table where she was doing feed bills. He stood in the doorway with the flashlight in one hand. "Come look at this," he said. His voice had a particular quality she hadn't heard from him in a while. Not excitement exactly, something more careful than that. Something that was trying very hard not to be hope, so it wouldn't have to be crushed later. She followed him to the barn. He held the flashlight behind the first egg in the batch. She leaned in close. There it was, a dark mass in the center, not quite round, and from it, spreading outward through the interior of the egg like tiny lightning, a web of blood vessels. "That's a live one," she said. "That's a live one," he confirmed. He held up another. Same thing. Dark center. Red threads fanning out. He went through the 20. 15 of them showed clear signs of viable embryonic development. 15 out of 20. Claire stood in the middle of the barn she had converted into a prayer and a gamble, and she felt something shift very quietly in her chest. 75% viability. Not 0. Not nothing. If that held across the full batch, not all 320, because some were certainly gone, but even if it held across half of them, she was looking at 100 birds, maybe more. She didn't say any of that out loud. Neither did Elias. They were Whitlocks, and Whitlocks had been burned by counting animals before they hatched for 3 generations. But Elias put his hand briefly on her shoulder on the way out of the barn, and she let him leave it there for a moment before she went back to work. On day 9, Gerald Pruitt drove out. He didn't call first. He just appeared in her driveway at 10 in the morning in his white F350 with the Pruitt Ranch logo on the door, and he climbed out and stood there in his good hat and his pressed shirt, and he looked at her like a man who has decided to deliver a piece of difficult news. "Came to see how things were going," he said. "Things are going fine, Gerald." "Mind if I take a look?" She did mind, actually, but she was raised to be polite about things she minded, so she walked him to the barn. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Then he walked slowly down the rows, hands in his pockets, looking at the cartons on their wire mesh pallets, the heaters, the thermometers mounted at 3 different heights on the wall, the humidity gauges. "Temperature holding steady?" he said. 99.2. "Turning them yourself?" 3 times a day, 4 if I'm anxious. He nodded slowly. He reached out and picked up one of the eggs. She stopped herself from saying anything because he'd been handling livestock for 40 years and he knew to be gentle. And he held it up, turned it, set it back down. "Heritage bronze," he said. "Yes." "Good birds, when they're managed right." He paused. "My grandmother kept a flock of them, before they became unfashionable." Another pause. He looked at her. "You've got a good setup here, Claire. Better than I expected." "Thank you, Gerald. I still think the hatch rate's going to disappoint you." I want to be honest about that. I appreciate your honesty. But I'll tell you something. He looked back at the rows of eggs. If even a quarter of them come through, a heritage flock on this kind of land, with the grasshopper problem you've had, that might be more valuable than you think. He said it like he was reluctant to say it, like a concession being dragged out of him. Turkeys hit grasshoppers hard, harder than chickens even. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. I know, she said. That's partly why I took them. He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been something else entirely. He walked back to the door. He stopped with one hand on the frame. Let me know how it turns out, he said. I mean that, genuinely. He left. Claire stood in the warm barn and looked at her eggs and thought, all right then, not an endorsement, not quite. But from Gerald Pruitt, it was close enough to matter. She went back to work. The night Gerald Pruitt drove away, Claire sat on an overturned bucket in the barn for a long time without moving. She wasn't resting. She was calculating. It was a thing she did when she was scared. Turn numbers over in her head the way you worry a loose tooth with your tongue, probing for the worst possibility, making herself face it so it couldn't ambush her later. If the hatch rate came in at 25%, she was looking at 80 birds. 80 heritage turkeys at $45 a bird at Thanksgiving was $3,600. That was not nothing. That was 2 months of operating costs, maybe 3 if she was careful. It was not enough to save the farm. It was not enough to make the loan payment that was due in November. But it was not nothing, and right now not nothing felt like something worth protecting. If the hatch rate came in at 75%, the rate Elias had candled in that first test batch, she was looking at something closer to 240 birds, which was a different conversation entirely. She told herself not to think about 75%. She told herself to think about the loan payment and the hay she needed to order before October, and the fact that her older ewe, the gray one her father had called Duchess, even though she had no dignity whatsoever, was favoring her left front leg and probably needed a vet call she couldn't afford. She told herself all of this, and then she sat there in the warm barn listening to the hum of the heaters and the occasional tick of the metal walls contracting in the cooler night air. And she thought about her grandmother's turkeys moving through tall grass, and she did not sleep. By day 12, word had gotten around in the particular way that news gets around in small agricultural communities, not through any single act of gossip, but through the slow accumulation of overheard conversations at the feed store, comments made at the co-op, things said in passing at the gas station on Route 12 that got repeated and modified and passed along until the story had taken on a shape somewhat larger than the truth. What people were saying by day 12 was that Claire Whitlock had gone and filled her barn with garbage eggs and was convinced she was going to hatch herself a turkey empire. The word empire was not something Claire had ever said. It had been added somewhere along the chain by someone who understood that a story needs a little dramatic reach to keep moving, and now it was stuck to the situation the way burrs stick to wool. She heard it first from Nora Kessel, who told it to her with the particular brand of apologetic amusement of someone who finds something funny and feels slightly bad about it. People are calling it your turkey empire, Nora said, handing Claire her receipt for layer pellets and scratch grain. I'm aware. Tom thinks it's brave, Nora paused. He also said something about quixotic, but Tom uses that word a lot, so... Tell Tom I appreciate brave. She drove home with the windows down and her jaw set, and when she got back to the barn, Elias was already there doing the midday turn, working his way down the rows with the quiet, methodical rhythm he'd developed over the past week. Pick up, rotate 180 degrees, set back down, move to the next one. And he didn't look up when she came in. You hear about the turkey empire, he said. I heard. Pruitt's son posted something on the County Agriculture Facebook group, Elias said, still not looking up. Said, and I'm reading this directly, thinking about Claire Whitlock down the road, hope she knows turkeys don't actually hatch from wishes. Claire picked up the flashlight from the shelf and started at the other end of the row. Which son? Brett. Brett Pruitt is 32 years old and has never successfully grown a crop in his life, she said. His father does everything. Brett just drives the good truck. That's true. Keep turning. They worked in silence for a while. The barn was at 99.1. The humidity gauge read 56%. Outside, she could hear the sheep moving in the near pasture. the soft percussion of their feet on dry ground, the occasional complaint of a ewe who had opinions about something. "I candled the northeast section this morning," Elias said after a while. She waited. 68 out of 74 showing development, he said. She kept turning eggs. She didn't say anything. "Claire, I heard you. 68 out of 74 is 91%. I know what 68 out of 74 is. That's not a bad number." "It's a very good number if it holds," she said. "It probably won't hold across the whole batch. Some of the eggs near the south wall have been running a little cooler. I'm going to rearrange them tonight." Still, he set an egg back down with particular care, like it was something fragile and important. "I'm starting to think this might actually work." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He was smiling a little, that careful smile he got when he was trying to contain something he didn't want to jinx. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't start believing yet. Believing makes you stupid. Keep your hands busy and your expectations low, and let's get to day 28 before we decide what this is." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You know, some people would consider that a depressing way to live." "Some people haven't had 2 bad seasons in a row." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He picked up the next egg. "But for the record, I already believe." She turned back to her row and did not answer, and for the rest of that morning she concentrated very hard on the mechanics of turning eggs, and not on the warm, dangerous feeling that was starting to build very quietly in her chest. The second phone call from Dale Richter came on day 14. She was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, standing at the counter, eating crackers because she'd forgotten to buy bread, when her phone rang with the hatchery's number. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. "Miss Whitlock," Richter said. He sounded different this time, less comfortable. "I heard you've got some development showing in those eggs." "Where'd you hear that?" A pause. "Word gets around." "It does," she agreed. She put down her crackers. "What can I do for you, Dale?" I want to make sure you understand that the release you signed is ironclad. Whatever happens with those eggs is entirely your situation. I'm not on the hook for anything." "I know that, Dale. You told me when I signed it." "Right." Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him breathing. "Out of curiosity, what kind of development are you seeing?" She almost smiled. Almost. "The kind that hatches in about 2 weeks." Silence. "I see," he said finally. "Is there something else you needed?" "No, No, good luck to you." He hung up. She stood there with her phone in her hand and her crackers on the counter, and she thought about the way his voice had shifted on those last few words, from the careful legal disclaimer tone to something smaller and slightly off balance. Like a man who had just realized he'd thrown away something that still had value, and had called to confirm it, and now wished he hadn't confirmed it. She put the phone in her pocket and went to the barn to do the morning turn. The 15th day was the worst day. It started at 3 in the morning when she woke up from a thin, anxious sleep to the smell of something wrong. Not smoke. Something more subtle. A warmth that was absent where it should have been present. A stillness in the air that her body recognized before her mind did. She was across the room and into her boots before she was fully awake. The space heater near the north wall of the barn had quit. She didn't know when. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3 hours. The thermometer nearest that section read 94 degrees, which meant the eggs in the north quadrant, about 80 of them, had been sitting 4 to 5 degrees below optimal temperature for some unknown period in the middle of the night. She stood in the barn in her boots and her flannel pajama shirt with the cold Montana air coming in through the gap under the east door, and she stared at that thermometer reading, and she felt the specific, hollow, sick feeling of watching something you've worked for start to come apart. She did not panic. She was too tired to panic properly. Instead, she went to the storage room, found the second heater, the one that sparked and made objecting sounds. And she plugged it in and stood back, and it sparked once, and then, with a reluctant grinding noise, it began to produce heat. She aimed it at the north quadrant. She moved the eggs nearest the cold zone to positions closer to the functioning heaters. She spent 40 minutes redistributing the load, rotating eggs that had been sitting wrong side down too long, checking for any that felt wrong in her hands. It was 5 in the morning before the north section came back to 98.5. She sat down on the bucket and she pressed her palms flat on her thighs and she breathed. How much damage had been done, she didn't know. Cold stress in late-stage incubation could kill developing embryos. It could cause developmental problems in survivors. Or, depending on how long the temperature had actually been down, depending on how healthy the embryos were going in, it might not kill them at all. Poultry embryos were more resilient than people thought. She'd read that. She was choosing to believe it. Elias found her at 6:30 when he came out for the morning turn. He took one look at her face and at the repositioned heater, and he said, "What happened?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. "Okay," he said when she finished. "What do you need?" "I need someone to run into town and get 2 backup heaters, not the cheap ones, the ones with the automatic thermostat shut off." "I'll go now. And I need coffee." "I'll make it before I go." He made the coffee. He drove to town. She stayed in the barn and watched the thermometers and turned eggs and drank bad coffee from a travel mug that leaked slightly at the seam, and she watched the temperature climb back to where it needed to be, and she did not think about the 80 eggs in the north quadrant and whether they were still alive inside. Not thinking about things you can't fix is a skill. It takes practice. She was still practicing. When Elias came back with the heaters, he also brought Nora Kessel, which was not something Claire had asked for, but which she understood immediately when Nora walked into the barn with a casserole dish covered in foil and a look on her face that said she already knew about the heater and was not going to mention it directly, but was going to feed Claire until Claire felt better. "Tom made his chicken and rice thing," Nora said, setting the dish on the old feed shelf. "It's not fancy." "It doesn't need to be fancy," Claire said. Nora walked slowly down the nearest row, looking at the eggs the way people look at things they find unexpectedly interesting. She picked one up, weighed it in her hand, set it back. "How many do you think made it through the night?" she said carefully. "I don't know yet. I'll candle the north section tomorrow and see what's changed." "And if some are gone?" Claire looked at her. "Then some are gone." Nora nodded. She had known Claire long enough not to push on things like this. She walked back to the feed shelf and stood there with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, looking at the whole setup, the heaters, the thermometers, the rows of brown cartons on wire mesh, and her expression was thoughtful in a way that Claire recognized as something more than idle curiosity. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Nora said. "What?" "My mother-in-law had heritage turkeys. 20 years ago, maybe more. She used to say they were smarter than chickens and dumber than dogs and better than both when it came to keeping a pasture healthy." She paused. "Tom's father got rid of them when he took over the operation. Said they weren't efficient enough, too slow to market." Another pause. "He's been fighting grasshoppers on that south section ever since." Claire said nothing. She let that sit between them in the warm air. "I'm just saying," Nora said, "that there's something to the idea that not everything old-fashioned is inefficient. Sometimes things get discarded before anyone bothers to understand what they were doing." She picked up Tom's casserole and handed it to Claire. "Eat something. You look like you've been awake since the Civil War." Itiet. On day 17, she candled the north section. 61 of the 80 showed continuing development. 19 were gone, embryos that had been too far along or too compromised by the temperature drop, or that had simply reached the end of what they could sustain. She removed them carefully and set them aside and did not let herself stand there too long. 61 was not 80, but 61 was not 0. She went through the rest of the batch that afternoon, working methodically section by section, Elias holding the flashlight while she candled each egg and called out the result. "Live, live, unclear, live, gone, live, live." And he marked them in the notebook he'd started keeping on day 3, neat columns in his cramped handwriting. At the end, he added the columns. 214 showing active development, he said. She did the math in her head, subtracted the 19 losses from the cold event, added the original 11 clears. So we've lost roughly 30 confirmed, maybe more that aren't showing clear development but might still come through, maybe fewer. Or, Elias said, looking at his notebook, we hatch 214. She looked at him. I know, he said, holding up one hand. Low expectations. Hands busy. Day 28 before we celebrate. I know your whole philosophy. It's not a philosophy. It's survival. It can be both. He closed the notebook. 214 Heritage Bronze Turkeys, Claire. At $45 a bird conservatively, Elias, that's $9,630. Even if we only sell half of them and keep the rest as breeding stock. I said don't. I'm not celebrating. I'm doing arithmetic. She looked at him. He looked back at her, utterly unrepentant. Fine, she said. Do your arithmetic in the house. I'm turning the south section. Brett Pruitt came by on day 19. She heard the truck first, too loud, too fast up the gravel drive, the kind of driving that announces a person who likes to be noticed. She was coming out of the barn with a bucket when he pulled up, a young man who wore his confidence like a jacket 2 sizes too big, all swagger and easy dismissal. Claire, he said, nodding at her like she was an employee he barely knew. How's the egg thing going? Fine, Brett. Dad says you've got some development showing. He said it the way you say something you find mildly ridiculous but are willing to pretend is interesting. So they're not all dead? No, she said. They're not all dead. Huh. He looked at the barn. You know, if this doesn't work out, I wanted to mention Dad and I have been talking about expanding the south lease. If you end up needing to consolidate, we'd be interested in discussing the Whitlock parcels. Nothing formal, just if it comes to that. He gave her a smile that was meant to be generous and landed somewhere closer to predatory. We'd give you a fair price. You wouldn't have to go through a broker. The bucket in her hand was heavy. She set it down slowly. Brett, she said. Yeah. I'm going to be straight with you because I've known your family my whole life and I think you deserve honesty. She kept her voice level. She was proud of that later. I am not selling any parcel of this farm. Not now, not in 6 months, not if every egg in that barn dies tomorrow. This land has been in my family for 83 years, and it will be here 83 years after I'm gone. And the next time you want to come by and offer to buy pieces of my property while pretending it's a favor, I'd appreciate it if you called first so I can make sure I'm not home. Brett Pruitt stared at her. She picked up her bucket and walked back to the barn. Behind her, she heard his truck door open and close and his engine start up, louder than necessary, and the crunch of gravel as he turned around too fast and drove away. She let out a long, slow breath once the sound of the engine faded. Her hands were shaking a little. Just a little. She gripped the bucket handle tighter and kept walking. Day 22, Elias made a mistake. He was doing the evening turn alone because Claire had to drive Duchess, the favoring you, to the large animal vet in Garrison, which was a 40-minute drive each way and cost her $160 she put on the emergency credit card. And when she came home at 9 o'clock with Duchess dosed on anti-inflammatories and a diagnosis of a mild hoof abscess that was going to resolve fine, she found Elias sitting on the bucket in the barn with his head in his hands. She stopped in the doorway. What? She said. He looked up. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen since he was maybe 15 years old and had broken the side mirror off their mother's car backing out of the garage. I dropped one, he said. She came into the barn. Show me. He pointed to a spot on the concrete floor near the east row. There was a dark stain there, already drying. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at Elias. Was it showing development? Yes. His voice was tight. I could see movement when I candled it this morning. Claire, I'm sorry. I had it in my hand and I lost my grip and... Okay. I'm sorry. Elias. She looked at him until he stopped talking. It was 1 egg. We have 213 others. You've been in this barn twice a day every day for 3 weeks, and you've turned thousands of eggs, and you dropped 1. That's not a disaster. It's a Tuesday. He stared at her. Are the rest of the evening turns done? Yes. Temperature okay? 99.2. Then go eat something and get some sleep. I'll do the 9 o'clock check. He stood up. He ran one hand over his face. He said, I genuinely don't know how you stay this calm. I'm not calm, she said. I'm just tired enough that the panic part of my brain is shut off temporarily. Go eat. He went to the house. She stood in the barn alone and looked at the dark stain on the concrete and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the specific grief of one small, lost life. Then she picked up the flashlight and started her check. Buck. On the morning of day 25, she found the first pip. She almost missed it. She was moving fast through the morning turn because she'd overslept by 40 minutes, the first time she'd overslept in 3 weeks. And she was irritated at herself and moving with more speed than precision, and she was on the third row of the northeast section when something made her stop. She looked down at the egg in her hand. At the very tip, barely visible, a small crack. A star-shaped fracture no bigger than the point of a pencil. And from inside, so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. A movement. A tiny, muscular, determined pushing from the interior. She stood completely still. "Elias," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He was at the other end of the barn. "What?" She couldn't find more words than this. She just held the egg up. He crossed the barn in about 4 steps. He looked at the egg. He looked at the pip, that tiny, critical first crack, the sign that something alive inside had decided the time had come, that the world outside the shell was worth breaking into. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Elias said, very quietly, "There it is." "There it is," she agreed. She set the egg back down with extraordinary care, in the warmest spot she could find in that section, and she stepped back and she looked at the 300 or so eggs that remained, and she felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't even known was locked. She didn't say anything about what it meant. She didn't do the math out loud. She went back to the morning turn, and she finished it, egg by egg, row by row. And her hands were very steady, and her face was very still, and she turned each one with the same care she'd been bringing to the job for 25 days. But when she got to the end of the last row and turned the last egg and straightened up and stretched her back, she allowed herself one thing. She smiled. Not a big smile. A small, private, 3-week-in-the-making smile that she directed at nobody in particular and the empty air of the barn. Then she picked up the flashlight and went to check the thermometers. The pip she'd found on day 25 did not hatch that day. It didn't hatch the next day either, which she knew intellectually was completely normal. The internal pip, where the chick breaks into the air cell, typically precedes the external pip by 12 to 24 hours, and the external pip, that first visible crack in the outer shell, could take another 12 to 24 hours after that before the bird actually emerged. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your body at 2 in the morning while you're crouched over an egg listening for sounds through the shell are 2 entirely different experiences. She listened anyway. Her knees hurt. The concrete was cold. She pressed her ear close to the egg and she heard very faintly a tapping. Rhythmic and small and absolutely certain of itself. Something alive in there, working. She went to bed at 2:30 and she slept badly and she was back in the barn by 5. The first one came out on the morning of day 26 at approximately 7:18 while Elias was making coffee in the kitchen and Claire was sitting 3 feet away watching a shell that had been zipping, cracking in a widening circle for the past 40 minutes. Zipping was the term. The chick rotates inside the shell, using the egg tooth on its beak to chip away at the interior in a slow, determined spiral. And when the circle is complete, the top of the shell simply lifts off like a lid, and what comes out is wet and exhausted and looks absolutely nothing like the animal it will become in a matter of hours. The lid came off. The poult, that was the word for a turkey chick, poult, a word that sounded too delicate for something that had just fought its way out of a sealed container using nothing but its own beak and determination. The poult lay in the broken shell for a moment, breathing. It was dark brown and wet, matted down with the effort of hatching, its eyes not quite open. Its legs moved weakly, finding purchase on the wire mesh beneath it. Claire didn't move. She sat on her bucket and she watched this bird that should not exist, that had been scheduled for a landfill, that everyone from Dale Richter to Gerald Pruitt's son had already written off, lie there in the wreckage of its shell and pull its first breath of the outside world into its lungs. Then it lifted its head, wobbly, uncertain, slightly cross-eyed in the way of very new things. But it lifted its head. It looked, if a 3-minute-old turkey can be said to look, around at the barn, at the light coming through the east window, at Claire sitting on her bucket with her hands pressed flat on her knees. "Hey," she said softly, to the bird, which she was aware was a slightly ridiculous thing to do. The poult blinked at her. "Okay," she said, just as quietly, "You made it." She heard Elias's boots on the gravel outside, and the barn door swung open, and he came in with 2 mugs of coffee, and he stopped when he saw her face. He looked at the hatching tray. He looked at the wet, wobbling, impossibly alive bird sitting in a broken shell. He set the mugs down very carefully on the nearest flat surface. He walked over and crouched beside Claire. He looked at the poult for a long moment. "Well," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Yeah," she said. They sat there together watching the bird dry out under the warmth of the heat lamps, and they didn't say anything else for a while, and neither of them touched their coffee until it was cold. The second one hatched at 9:45, the third at 11. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 7 poults in the brooding section. A smaller, warmer area Claire had partitioned off at the end of the barn, using plywood panels and extra heat lamps, and by the time the sun went down that first day, there were 19. 19 birds. Alive. Loud. In the particular high-pitched peeping way of very young poultry, a sound that filled the barn and spilled out the door and carried on the evening air across the nearest pasture. Elias said, "It's loud." "Yes, like really loud." "Turkeys are not quiet animals, Elias." "I didn't realize." He peered into the brooding section where the poults moved in a soft, crowded mass under the lamps. "They're kind of ugly right now. They're wet. Still." "In 3 weeks they'll be beautiful," she said, and then immediately regretted using the word beautiful about livestock, which was the kind of thing her father had always warned against, because beautiful animals get names and named animals don't go to market. She was not going to name these turkeys. She was absolutely not going to name these turkeys. She named the first one 19, after the number of eggs that had come out that first day. That was practically a number, not a name. The hatching continued for 3 days. Not smoothly. Nothing in that barn had been smooth since day 1, and hatching was no different. Some eggs pipped and then went quiet and didn't progress, and she had to make the terrible judgment call on each one about whether to assist or wait. Assisting a hatch that isn't ready will kill the bird as surely as abandoning it. The blood vessels in the membrane need to dry down before the chick can emerge safely, and a well-meaning human hand pulling too early just trades one kind of death for another. She waited on most of them. It was the hardest waiting she'd ever done. 3 she lost to what she was fairly certain was aspergillus, a mold infection that could develop in compromised eggs, particularly ones that had been through temperature stress. She found them not hatched, but gone in a different way. The shells intact but wrong-smelling when she finally moved them, and she disposed of them quickly and didn't dwell on it because dwelling wasn't going to help the 200 eggs that still had a chance. On the second night of hatching, a pip she'd been watching for 16 hours suddenly went silent. She sat with it for another 2 hours. Nothing. She picked it up very carefully and listened and tapped the shell gently with one fingernail, a trick she'd read about, the sound of a tapping nail sometimes prompting a response from a live bird inside. And she waited. Silence. She set it aside with the others she was watching, and she went to the brooding section and she counted the birds already there, 47, warm and dry, and increasingly loud. And she let that number do some work against the one she was losing. Elias found her at midnight sitting on the bucket with the notebook in her lap, making small marks next to numbers. "You should sleep," he said, "in a while." He sat down on an overturned feed tub beside her. He didn't tell her to sleep again. Instead, he said, "What are you writing?" "Counts, which rows, which sections. I want to know where the losses are clustering. And north quadrant, where the heater went out." She showed him the page. "The mortality rate in that section is running about twice what it is in the rest of the barn, which means the cold event on day 15 killed more than I thought." He looked at the numbers. "But the other sections?" "Other sections are running about 8% loss, which is—" She paused. She pressed her lips together. "Which is better than I thought, honestly. Commercial hatcheries aim for 5 to 10. We're right in that range for the sections that didn't have the temperature problem." Elias was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing the math. "So total," he said carefully. "I don't want to count yet. Claire, I'm not counting until they're all out," she said. 3 more days of possible hatching. I'm not counting." He respected that. He sat with her for another hour, and then he went to bed and she stayed in the barn until 2, listening to 50-some birds sleep under their lamps, and she did not count. The last egg that was going to hatch hatched on the morning of day 28 plus 2, 30 days total from when she'd brought them home, which put them at somewhere between 56 and 60 days from original setting if Richter's timeline had been accurate, which he doubted slightly in the direction of the eggs being younger than he'd claimed, because hatchery managers who are trying to dispose of surplus will sometimes round up the age to make the discard feel more justified. She let herself think that. Maybe it wasn't generous, but it felt true. The last egg was in the northeast section. She'd been watching it since the previous afternoon, a pip that had progressed slowly and then stalled, and then, very early in the morning, when the barn was at its quietest and the other birds were beginning to stir, resumed. She heard the zipping begin at around 5:30. She sat and watched it for an hour, while the light changed outside and the birds in the brooding section woke up and started their morning noise. The lid came off at 6:44. The last poult was smaller than most of the others. It lay in its shell for longer than average, breathing, gathering something, and then it got up on legs that shook for the first 3 steps and steadied on the 4th. And it walked, not stumbled, directly into the warmest part of the brooding section and sat down in the middle of the pile of its kind and closed its eyes. Claire watched it do all of this. Then she picked up the notebook and she counted. She counted the live birds in the brooding section twice because she didn't trust herself the first time. She counted them a third time with Elias standing beside her, his hand moving to point at each bird as she called the number. 237, she said. She looked at Elias. 237. He stared at her. From 320 eggs that were on their way to a landfill, she said, after a heater failure on day 15 and 3 days of suboptimal humidity in the first week and one dropping on the concrete and everything else. She looked down at the notebook. Her handwriting was shakier than usual. 237. Elias sat down on the bucket. Hard, like his knees gave out. He put his hands over his face. His shoulders moved once, a single shudder that he controlled almost immediately, and when he pulled his hands down, his eyes were red at the edges, but he was composed mostly. 237, he said. 237. That's... He stopped. Claire, that's a 74% hatch rate, from 26-plus day eggs that had been sitting in a hatchery at wrong temperature for who knows how long before you got them. That's... He shook his head. I don't even know what to say about that number. It's a good number, she said. It's an incredible number. It's a number that means we have a lot of work ahead of us. He laughed. It came out a little ragged. Yeah, it does. He looked at the birds, 237 of them, most of them sleeping in a warm heap under the lamps, a few of the bolder ones already starting to explore the edges of the brooding section, pecking at the wire, investigating the world with the particular combination of curiosity and recklessness that seemed to be the heritage turkey's defining characteristic. What do we do now? We raise them, she said simply. She called Nora Kessel first. Then she let Nora tell everyone else. By afternoon, the County Agriculture Facebook group had a post, not from Brett Pruitt this time, that said simply, Claire Whitlock hatched 237 heritage turkeys from the Garrison Valley surplus eggs, 74% hatch rate. In a dairy barn. Respect. It had 43 comments by evening. Gerald Pruitt called her at 6. I heard, he said, 237. 237. A long pause. That's not what I expected. I know. I want to say something, he said, and his voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. A careful, deliberate quality. The voice of a man choosing words the way you choose steps on ice. I told you to be prepared for disappointment. I said that to your face. You did. I was wrong to say it the way I said it. I wasn't giving you credit for what you were actually doing, which was a serious operation, conducted carefully, and I want to acknowledge that. She sat in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and the evening light coming through the window at a low angle, and she let Gerald Pruitt's acknowledgement sit there in the air between them for a moment. It cost him something to say it, she could tell. Men like Gerald Pruitt didn't recalibrate easily or often. I appreciate that, Gerald, she said. Genuinely. How long before they're pasture ready? 6 weeks to 8 weeks before I can put them out on grass. They need to be fully feathered. I'll start rotating them through the south pasture sections in October if the weather holds. The grasshopper pressure's still bad on my east section, he said, not quite casually. I've spent $4,000 on biological controls this season, and I'm not sure it's doing much. Turkeys are better, she said. Another pause. Yeah, he said. My grandmother always said that. She almost said, I know, but she held it back, because she didn't need to win that particular exchange. She had 237 birds in her barn, and a farm that still had its mortgage, and a November payment she now had a credible plan for making. That was enough for one day. I'll keep you posted on the pasture rotation schedule, she said. Do that. He cleared his throat. Good work, Claire. He hung up. Bum. The call from Dale Richter came 2 days later, and it was a different kind of call entirely. She was in the south pasture checking fence line. The sheep had been pushing the east section hard, and there was always something giving way, when her phone rang. She almost let it go to voicemail. She answered. 237, Richter said. No greeting. Just those 2 words, flat and specific. Hello, Dale? I heard 237, for my eggs. From the eggs you were throwing away, she said pleasantly. Yes. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who is processing several things at once. The financial implication, the reputational one, the simple fact of having been wrong in a public and increasingly well-documented way. What's your plan for them? He said finally. You selling at Thanksgiving? Some of them. I'm keeping the hens to build a breeding flock. The toms I'll take to market in November. Heritage bronze toms at Thanksgiving. He said it slowly, like he was calculating. You're looking at premium prices, $40, $50 a bird minimum, probably more if you market them right. I know. He stopped. That's significant. Yes, it is. She waited. She'd learned early that silence in a business conversation was not something that needed to be filled. Silence put pressure on the other person, and right now she was happy to let Dale Richter feel the full weight of what he'd almost sent to the landfill. I want to talk to you, he said. About a possible arrangement for next season. She stopped walking. What kind of arrangement? We've got surplus every season. Heritage breeds especially. The production timeline doesn't always line up with buyer demand, and we end up with viable eggs that we're disposing of. If there's a way to get those into the hands of, he paused, of farms that can use them, rather than throwing them away, rather than disposing of them, he said, with slight emphasis that she interpreted as, I'm not going to say throwing away twice in one conversation. It would benefit both parties. You get stock at no cost. We reduce waste. And frankly, from a public relations standpoint, Dale, she said, yeah. Let's meet next week. You can bring the proposal and I'll tell you what I can and can't agree to. But I want it in writing, whatever we decide, and I want to be involved in how the program is structured, not just as the recipient, as a partner. A longer pause this time. She could almost hear him deciding whether he was the kind of man who could accept that. All right, he said. Tuesday morning work? Tuesday at 9. I'll be there. He hung up. She stood in the middle of her south pasture with the dry August grass around her ankles and the fence stretching away on both sides, and she thought about a man behind a clipboard saying, toss 'em and not looking up. Then she went back to checking fence line. There was a section near the east gate that had been sagging for a week, and she needed to fix it before the sheep found it. The weeks that followed the hatch were not easy in any straightforward sense, because 237 young turkeys were a massive amount of work, and the romantic notion of a flock roaming free across rolling pastures bore approximately no relationship to the reality of raising poultry from poult to market weight. The brooding stage alone required constant management. Temperature regulation for young poultry is critical. Too cold and they pile on top of each other, and the ones on the bottom suffocate. Too hot, and they spread away from the heat source and stop eating. She was adjusting lamp heights twice a day in the first week, reading the distribution of the flock the way you read a text. Clustered tight means cold. Spread wide against the walls means hot. Evenly distributed and moving actively means you've got it right. She had it right maybe 60% of the time. The other 40% she was adjusting. There were losses, not dramatic ones, no single catastrophic event like the heater failure in the incubation phase, but the small, steady attrition that comes with raising any young stock. A poult that hadn't started eating well and fell behind the others and was gone one morning. Two that got chilled in the first week when a lamp failed overnight. One that was simply weak from hatching and never quite caught up. By the end of week 2 in the brooding stage, she had 229. She told Elias the number at dinner, and he said, "Still 229." And she said, "Yes, still 229." And that was the whole conversation on the subject, because they were both too tired to have a longer one. The feeding was expensive. Not catastrophically expensive, because young turkeys are efficient converters, and heritage breeds in particular are hardwired to forage and supplement their diet with whatever they can find. Insects, seeds, greens. But they were still in the barn, still being started on commercial starter feed, and the cost was accumulating on a credit card that was already closer to its limit than she liked. She sold 6 of the earliest maturing toms in early September, just 6, to a specialty butcher in Garrison who paid $55 a bird and asked if she had more, and put the $330 directly against the feed bill. $55 a bird, Elias said when she told him. Heritage, free range, humanely raised, vintage breed. People will pay for that. People will pay $55 for a turkey they could get at the grocery store for $12. People will pay $55 for a turkey that tastes like what a turkey is supposed to taste like, she said, which is not the same thing as a grocery store turkey, not even close. He considered this. I should eat more turkey. You should eat the one I'm planning to keep for our Thanksgiving. We're keeping one? Provisionally. What's her name? She looked at him. The turkeys don't have names. Claire. You named the first one 19. That's a number, not a name. It's a name. She put her fork down. She looked at her plate. She picked her fork back up. Her name, she said with great dignity, is not something I'm prepared to discuss at the dinner table. Elias grinned into his coffee. He let her have that. The first time she moved a section of the flock out to the south pasture, it was the first week of October, and the birds were 8 weeks old and fully feathered and ready, and she opened the door to the temporary pen she'd built in the corner of the pasture and watched them. They didn't rush out. That was the thing nobody told you about heritage turkeys encountering the outdoors for the first time. They were cautious. They stood in the doorway in a cluster and looked out at the pasture with their heads moving in that sharp, angular way turkeys have, scanning, assessing. One of the bolder ones stepped out first, then jerked back as a gust of wind moved through the grass. "Come on," Elias said quietly, from beside her. Not to her, to the birds. The bold one stepped out again. This time it stayed out. It took 3 steps into the grass. It stopped. It looked down at the ground. Then it lunged forward and came up with a grasshopper in its beak. It threw its head back and swallowed, and in the 2 seconds that followed, approximately 40 other turkeys came boiling out of the pen door and into the pasture like a flood that had found its outlet, and the sound they made, not quite a gobble from the juveniles, more of a rolling, excited murmur that built as they spread out through the grass, was something Claire felt in her sternum before she processed it with her ears. They hit that pasture like they'd been designed specifically to destroy every insect in it, because they had been. She stood at the fence and watched 200 and some heritage bronze turkeys move through her grasshopper-decimated south pasture like a purposeful, feathered army, and she understood for the first time, not intellectually, not from what her phone had told her about foraging ratios and insect protein conversion, but in her gut, and the place where farmers store the things they know from watching, what these birds actually were. They were a biological solution to a biological problem. They were what this land had been missing. "Look at them go," Elias said. She looked. A bird near the center of the spread had found something significant. She couldn't see what from where she stood, and was doing a hard sprint across the grass in pursuit of it, wings half spread for balance. 3 others immediately gave chase in case the first bird had found something worth stealing. "The grasshopper pressure on the south section," she said, thinking out loud, "has been killing my pasture grass for 2 seasons. The grass goes, the sheep don't gain weight, the soil loses structure, the grasshoppers get worse because there's nothing checking them." "Yeah," Elias said. These birds eat 8 to 12% of their body weight per day in foraging conditions. 200 birds, call it an average body weight of 10 pounds by early November, that's 20,000 pounds of birds consuming 8 to 12% in insects and seeds and whatever else they find. Per day. Elias did the math quietly. That's a lot of grasshoppers, she said. He turned to look at her. Claire, this isn't just a Thanksgiving turkey operation. No, she said, it's not. This is... He stopped. He looked out at the birds spread across the brown late-season pasture in their bronze-feathered hundreds, moving with focused, relentless purpose through the dead and dying grass. This is pasture management. This is how it used to be done, she said, before everyone decided that efficiency meant monoculture and chemical inputs and breeds that can't survive without climate-controlled facilities. She watched a turkey make a decisive strike at something near a fence post. Somebody decided these birds were inefficient and got rid of them. And then they spent 40 years trying to fix with chemicals and labor what the birds were already fixing for free. She said it quietly, not with anger. She'd moved past the anger part somewhere in the 26 days she'd spent turning eggs in a heated dairy barn. This was something different, something steadier. Elias was quiet for a moment. The birds moved and called and hunted. You know, he said, I think you might have actually figured something out. She leaned on the fence rail and watched her flock work the land. The November payment was 12 weeks away. She had 229 birds and a specialty butcher who wanted more, and a pasture that was for the first time in 2 years starting to look like something other than a loss. I think Grandma already figured it out, she said, 60 years ago. I'm just the one who remembered. The wind came across from the north and moved through the dry grass, and the birds moved with it, following the disturbance, finding what it flushed. She watched them for a long time. The turkeys had been on the south pasture for 11 days when Gerald Pruitt drove out for the second time. This visit was different from the first. He didn't pull in fast or park with authority the way he usually did. He came slowly up the gravel drive and stopped the truck at the fence line and sat there for a moment before he got out. And Claire, who was checking water lines in the near section, watched him and understood that he was looking at something that was making him recalibrate again. The south pasture, 11 days in, looked different from the south pasture she'd been fighting for 2 seasons. It wasn't dramatic. She'd been careful not to build that expectation in her own head. The grass wasn't magically lush and green. It was still late October grass in central Montana, which meant dry and brown and honest about what the season had done to it. But the soil surface was different. The birds' feet had worked it, scratched it, broken up the hard cap that drought and overgrazing had been building for 2 years. Their manure was distributing nitrogen in small, dense deposits across the whole section. And the grasshoppers that had been her south pasture's defining feature for 2 brutal seasons, were reduced to something she could walk through without her pant legs hitting them at every step. Gerald Pruitt stood at the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at all of this for a long time before he said anything. How long have they been out here? He said. 11 days. He nodded slowly. He looked at the flock. They were working the far corner that morning, a shifting bronze mass against the brown grass, audible even from the fence as a low, constant murmur of industry. That grasshopper population is noticeably down. Yes. In 11 days. Yes. He was quiet again. She let him be quiet. She'd learned that about Gerald Pruitt over the past 2 months. He processed things thoroughly before he spoke. And if you rushed him, he just went tighter and said less. So she leaned on the fence rail and looked at her birds and waited. I want to talk to you about something, he said finally. Okay. My east section, the one I mentioned on the phone. He kept his eyes on the flock. $4,000 in biological controls this season, and I've still got grasshopper pressure that's costing me on lamb weights. My numbers are down 6% from last year, and my vet says it's partly parasite load and partly nutrition, and the nutrition problem is grass quality, and the grass quality problem is insect pressure and soil compaction, she said. Yeah. A pause. I've been thinking about what you said, about this being how it used to be done. She waited. I want to borrow some birds, he said. It came out with the slight stiffness of a man asking for something he's not accustomed to needing. Rotating through my east section, Whatever arrangement makes sense, I'd cover their feed supplement cost while they're on my land, or pay a per acre fee, or... He stopped. He looked at her for the first time. I don't know what the right arrangement is. That's why I'm here asking instead of telling. That last part, asking instead of telling, landed differently than anything Gerald Pruitt had said to her in her entire adult life. She recognized it for what it was, an old man revising himself. It was not easy to do, and not everyone could manage it, and she respected it more than she was going to show him right now. How many acres is the east section? She said. 60. She thought about it. She had 229 birds, minus the toms she was planning to take to market in November. If she kept the hens for breeding, and she was keeping the hens, that was the whole long-game point of this operation. She had roughly 110, 115 hens to work with after the November harvest. She needed some of those on her own land, but 60 acres was not an unreasonable rotation. 30 birds, Mom, she said, rotating through in sections so they're not hammering any one spot too hard. 8 weeks minimum on your land. I retain ownership. They come back here for the winter. You cover feed supplement, and I want daily water access maintained. And I want to walk the section before and after and document the change. He looked at her. Document it for what? Because I'm going to be making this case to other people, she said. And when I make it, I want data. A long pause. Something moved across Gerald Pruitt's face. Not quite a smile, but its structural precursor. All right, he said. Deal. They shook hands at the fence line. His grip was dry and firm and brief, the handshake of a man who meant what he agreed to. He left. She turned back to her pasture. 30 birds to Gerald Pruitt's east section, a November market run that was going to cover the loan payment with something left over, a meeting with Dale Richter on Tuesday that was going to produce a surplus egg partnership if she negotiated it right. And underneath all of that, a question she'd been turning over for the past week, quiet and persistent. What happened after this season, and the one after that, and the one after that? The answer, she was starting to think, was bigger than one farm. E.T. The Tuesday meeting with Richter happened in her kitchen, not at the hatchery, because she'd decided the home ground mattered and she wasn't going to give it up for the sake of seeming flexible. She made coffee. She put a legal pad on the table and a pen beside it, and she sat down across from Dale Richter, who had driven out in a clean truck and was wearing a collared shirt, which told her he was taking this more seriously than he'd let on by phone. Elias sat at the counter with his own coffee and his notebook, which Claire had asked him to bring because she wanted a second set of ears on anything that got agreed to. Richter laid out his idea. It was broadly what he'd outlined on the phone, a surplus egg program where Garrison Valley would offer their end-of-cycle fertile eggs to small family farms at no cost, rather than disposing of them. In exchange, the farms would provide documentation of hatch rates and outcomes, which Richter could use to argue to his board that the program created goodwill and regional agricultural value rather than just eliminating a disposal cost. Who controls which farms get eggs? Claire said. We'd have final say on distribution, Richter said. No, she said. He looked up from the paper he'd brought. No? You can have input. You can set minimum requirements, farm size, infrastructure, demonstrated capacity to manage incubation. But I want a community committee involved in selection. Farms that receive eggs should be chosen by people who understand what those farms need and what they can handle, not by a hatchery operation with its own financial interests in who succeeds and who doesn't. Richter's jaw tightened slightly. That's a significant limitation on our operational control. Dale, she kept her voice even. 3 weeks ago, you were throwing those eggs away. You didn't have operational control over them because you didn't think they had value. Now that somebody has demonstrated the value, the question is whether you want to be the operation that helped build something or the operation that tried to control something it almost sent to a landfill. She let that sit for a moment. The committee model protects you too. If a farm fails with eggs we refer, that's not on Garrison Valley. If you're making all the selection decisions, everything that goes wrong is your liability. He was quiet. She watched him think. Elias, from the counter, made a small sound that Claire recognized as him working not to say something. She appreciated the restraint. Community committee, Richter said finally. Who chairs it? I'll chair it the first year, she said. After that, we rotate. And documentation of hatch rates and outcomes goes to the committee and to Garrison Valley jointly. And I want the data published, not locked up in your files. If we're building a case for heritage breed conservation and sustainable pasture management, the data needs to be public. Another pause. Richter picked up the pen she'd set on the table. He turned it over in his fingers once, twice. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at her. You came in here, he said, planning to chair a committee. I came in here having thought through what would make this work long-term instead of just this season, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. All right, he said, I'll bring the committee model to my board. I can't commit to it today, but I'll bring it. That's all I'm asking. The data publication? Non-negotiable, she said pleasantly. He wrote something on his paper. He capped the pen. You're harder to deal with than I expected, he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was more like an observation a man makes when a thing turns out to be a different weight than he estimated. You threw my eggs away, she said, with exactly the same pleasantness. We can call it even. Richter left an hour later. Elias waited until the sound of the truck had fully faded down the gravel road before he spoke. Community committee, he said. It's the right structure. I know it's the right structure. He set down his coffee mug. 6 weeks ago, you were sitting in that barn counting dead eggs at midnight. Now you're negotiating regional agricultural policy in your kitchen. She started clearing the cups from the table. The dead eggs and the regional agricultural policy are the same problem, she said. I just finally got close enough to see the whole shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. Dad would have liked this, he said. Not loudly, almost to himself. She set the cups in the sink. She stood there with her hands on the edge of the counter, and she looked out the kitchen window at the south pasture where the turkeys were still working, still moving, still doing the work they'd been built for. Yeah, she said. He would have. The researchers arrived the second week of November. There were two of them, Dr. Mara Sokoloff and her graduate student, a young man named Patrick, who carried a tablet everywhere and had the slightly dazed look of someone who had read extensively about something and was now seeing it in a form that didn't quite match the literature. They were from the Agricultural Extension Program at the State University, and they'd heard about the Whitlock operation through what Dr. Sokoloff described carefully as informal professional channels, which Claire took to mean someone had seen the Facebook post and forwarded it up a chain until it landed on someone's desk. Dr. Sokoloff was maybe 50, compact and direct in the way of people who spend a lot of time in the field and have limited patience for small talk. She shook Claire's hand, looked at the south pasture for about 45 seconds, and said, Can I pull some soil cores? Knock yourself out, Claire said. They spent 2 days on the property. They pulled soil cores from the section the turkeys had been working and from an adjacent section that had been rested, and they took grasshopper counts using a sweep net protocol that Patrick explained at length to Elias while Dr. Sokoloff walked the fence lines alone making notes. They asked Claire detailed questions about the incubation process, the brooding setup, the feed supplement regimen, the rotation schedule, the integration with the sheep operation. She answered all of it. She showed them the notebook Elias had kept since day 3, hatch counts by section, temperature logs, loss records, candling data, and Dr. Sokoloff went through it with a focused intensity that Claire recognized as a person encountering data that was better than they'd hoped for. This record-keeping, Dr. Sokoloff said, on the afternoon of the second day, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open. Did you have a protocol going in, or did you develop this as you went? As I went, Claire said, I needed to know what was working and what wasn't, and I figured if this turned out to be something worth repeating, I'd want to know exactly what I did. You were thinking about replicability. I was thinking about not making the same mistake twice, Claire said. If you want to call that replicability, that's your word. Dr. Sokoloff looked at her over the notebook. Do you have any formal agricultural training? I have an 83-year-old farm, Claire said. That's my training. Patrick from across the table made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. He looked at his tablet very intently when Dr. Sokoloff glanced at him. I want to come back in the spring, Dr. Sokoloff said, with a full soil analysis team. I want to document the pasture recovery over a full growing season. What you're describing, the insect pressure reduction, the soil structure improvement, the integration with the sheep operation. If the data holds up the way your preliminary numbers suggest, this is a publishable outcome. Published where? Claire said. Peer-reviewed agricultural journal, sustainable land management, possibly 2 journals. There's an aspect of the heritage breed conservation angle that would interest the genetics people. Claire looked at Dr. Sokoloff. She thought about what she'd said to Richter about data needing to be public. She thought about all the small farms in this county that were fighting the same grasshopper problem, the same soil depletion problem, the same cascade of compounding losses that happened when the biological complexity of a working farm got stripped down to its bare, vulnerable minimum. All right, she said, come back in the spring, but I want to be listed as a co-contributor on whatever you publish, not acknowledged at the bottom, co-contributor. Dr. Sokoloff didn't hesitate. Done, she said. You generated the methodology. That's co-contributor by any standard I'd apply. They shook on it at the kitchen table, and Patrick wrote something in his tablet, and Elias refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, which was his particular way of expressing approval. But November Market Day was the 3rd Saturday of the month, and Claire loaded 94 Heritage Bronze Toms into her stock trailer at 4:30 in the morning and drove to the processing facility in Garrison that had been handling her sheep for 6 years and had recently added poultry. 94 Toms. The remaining birds, 135 hens and the dozen Toms she'd pulled back for breeding, stayed at the farm with Elias watching them. She'd pre-sold 40 of the 94 to the specialty butcher who'd bought her first 6 in September, a man named Hector Barrientos, who ran a shop on the west side of Garrison that specialized in what he called food worth paying for, and who had been calling her every 2 weeks since September to make sure she hadn't changed her mind about the order. She hadn't changed her mind. The remaining 54 birds she'd posted on a local food network, Heritage Breed, November delivery, and she'd sold out in 9 days at $48 a bird. She'd had 17 additional inquiries she couldn't fill, which she'd written down in the notebook with the intention of filling them next season. The processing went well, meaning it went the way it was supposed to go, which was efficiently and without drama, and by noon she had 94 birds done and she drove them to Hector's shop first because his order was biggest and his cold storage was best, and he met her at the loading dock personally, which was not something he did for most suppliers. I want to talk to you about next year, he said, before she'd even finished unloading. I figured. How many birds can you commit to? She'd been thinking about this since October. 200 Toms, November delivery, roughly, depending on hatch rates, which I can't guarantee. He looked at the bird she was unloading. He picked one up and weighed it in his hands. A big, dense, bronze-feathered bird with the solid architecture of a heritage breed grown at a proper pace on real forage. Nothing like the commercial birds he got from the regional distributor, which were white and soft and bred to the point of biological absurdity. 248, he said. At 52, she said. These birds are a year older in your customers' mouths, and you know it. He set the bird down. He looked at her. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a butcher's forearms and an expression that gave away very little. 50, he said. 51, and I'll give you first right of refusal on anything I produce above 200. A pause. Not a long one. Done, he said. She drove to the other delivery locations, a farm stand on Route 12, a restaurant in town whose chef had called her in October with slightly embarrassing enthusiasm about heritage turkeys and their fat distribution, 3 individual families who'd found her through the Food Network posting, and by 3 in the afternoon she was done. She sat in the parking lot of the last stop and she did the math on the back of the receipt from the processing facility. 94 birds, average price across the different buyers, processing and transport costs. Net $6,412. She stared at that number for a while. The November loan payment was $4,200. She'd been planning to cover it with the turkey money and raid the emergency card for the difference. Instead, she was sitting here with $6,412 and a feed bill that was 3 months current for the first time since her second bad season. She was not going to cry in a parking lot in Garrison, Montana at 3 in the afternoon. She was a practical woman, and practical women did not do that. She cried for approximately 4 minutes. Quietly, with the truck windows up and the radio off. The kind of crying that isn't really about sadness, but about the release of pressure that has been building for so long you'd forgotten it was there. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and drove home. Elias was waiting on the porch when she pulled in. He had 2 beers, actual cold bottles, not cans, which meant he'd planned this, and he handed her one when she climbed out of the truck. "How'd it go?" he said. 6-4-12. He stopped with his bottle halfway to his mouth. He looked at her. "Net?" "Net." He finished raising the bottle to his mouth and took a long, slow drink and looked out at the south pasture where the remaining flock was moving in the late afternoon light. 6-4-12, he said again, mostly to himself. "Payments covered. Feed bills current. I've got margin going into winter for the first time in 2 years." She took a drink of her beer. It was cold and good. "And I pre-negotiated $51 a bird for 200 toms next November." He turned and looked at her fully. "You negotiated the price today? After the sale?" "For next year." "While you were delivering?" "While I was at Hector's dock, yes." He looked at her with an expression she didn't see from him often, something between admiration and the faint exasperation of a younger sibling who has spent a lifetime being surprised by a person he thought he fully understood. "You know what you are," he said. "Don't." "You're actually kind of terrifying." "I said don't." He grinned. She let herself grin back, just slightly, and she looked at her farm in the late November light. The barn with its new heaters and its empty brooding section, the pastures where her hens were moving, the fence lines she'd fixed 3 times this fall, the sheep in the north section who were heavier this October than last because the south pasture grass, recovering already under the turkey's influence, had been better foraged than the year before. Gerald Pruitt's 30 birds had been on his east section for 3 weeks. He'd called her yesterday to say his sweep counts were showing a 40% reduction in grasshopper density. He'd said it the way Gerald Pruitt said everything, carefully, with appropriate qualification, but underneath the careful calibration she could hear the thing he wasn't quite saying, which was that it was working better than he'd expected, and he wasn't entirely sure how to hold that. She'd told him she'd document it and add it to the data set. He'd said that seemed reasonable. Then he'd said, quietly before hanging up, "My grandmother would have liked you." She'd thought about that for the rest of the day. The call that changed the season's shape came on a Thursday in early December, and it came from someone she didn't know. His name was Frank Delacroix, and he ran a 300-acre mixed operation about 40 minutes east, on the other side of the Garrison River. He'd heard about her from Gerald Pruitt. He'd also heard about the surplus egg program she was developing with Richter, which was further along than she'd expected. Richter had brought it to his board in November, and it had been approved in principle, with the committee structure intact, which had surprised her enough that she'd made him repeat it when he called. Frank Delacroix wanted eggs. Not to buy. Not for charity. He wanted to be part of the program. He had an old greenhouse structure on his property he thought could be converted to an incubation facility. He had 2 grown sons who were helping run the operation, and who were, he said, looking for something to do that isn't just repeating what we've always done. "How much land are you fighting grasshopper pressure on?" Claire said. "About 160 acres. South and east sections especially. I've been doing chemical controls for 4 years, and every year it gets worse." "It always gets worse," she said, "because you're killing the predatory insects along with the grasshoppers, and you're leaving the soil biology in worse shape every cycle." A pause. "Yeah," he said, "I've started to understand that." "Have you read the Sokoloff data?" Dr. Sokoloff had emailed Claire a preliminary findings summary 2 weeks earlier with the note that a formal paper was 8 months from submission. But the early soil core results were, in Dr. Sokoloff's words, striking in a way I don't use casually. "I read the summary you posted on the county agriculture group," Delacroix said. She'd posted it herself, the full summary with Dr. Sokoloff's permission, on the same Facebook group where Brett Pruitt had made his comment about wishes and turkeys. The post had been shared 47 times in 3 days, which was approximately 47 times more than she'd expected from a county agriculture group, and suggested the grasshopper problem was much more widespread than she'd been thinking of it. "Come out on Saturday," she said. "Bring your sons. I'll show you the operation and you can tell me what your greenhouse structure looks like, and we'll figure out if the program fits your situation." "I appreciate that," he said. "I want to say, I know you don't know me. I know this is your program and your work. I'm not trying to—" "Frank," she said. If you come out here Saturday and you're serious about this, you're not taking anything from me. That's not how this works. The more farms running healthy bird operations on integrated pasture, the better the data gets, the stronger the case gets, the more the program grows. Your success makes my success more meaningful, not less. A long pause. All right, he said. Saturday. Odd. Frank Delacroix arrived Saturday with his sons, Marcus and Danny, both of them in their early 30s and equipped with the combination of energy and uncertainty that belongs to people standing at the beginning of something. They can see as important but can't yet fully see the shape of. She walked them through the barn, through the south pasture, through the rotation system she'd developed, through the soil and insect data she'd been collecting since October. Danny, the younger son, crouched down in the south pasture and dug one finger into the soil and held it up and looked at it. This is loose, he said. The soil. Our south section is like concrete right now. Yours was like this 6 months ago, she said. The bird scratching and the manure distribution breaks the surface compaction. The roots can get back in. The water retention improves. The whole system starts to recover. Marcus was watching the flock moving at the far end of the section. They just do this naturally. You don't have to direct them. They're doing what they evolved to do, she said, on land that evolved with animals like them. The only mistake was taking them out. Frank Delacroix had been listening and not saying much, which she'd come to recognize in the short time she'd known him as his normal mode. He was a quiet man with a big operation and the look of someone who had been worrying about something for a long time. I want to apply to the program, he said, when she finished showing them the incubation setup in the barn. Formally, whatever the process is. The first committee meeting is in January, she said. I'll get you the date. And the eggs. We'd be getting this season's surplus starting when? Spring setting season, March, April. Richter's committing 50 to 100 surplus eggs per participating farm for the first year, depending on production. He looked at his sons. Something passed between them. A look that Claire had seen pass between Elias and herself in moments of alignment, a shorthand that comes from people who know each other well enough to say things without speaking. We're in, Marcus said, before his father could speak. Frank Delacroix looked at his son. Then he looked at Claire. What he said, he told her. She walked them back to their truck. Danny was asking Elias something about heat lamp configurations. Elias, who had become, somewhat improbably, the person people asked about heritage turkey incubation in Garrison County, Montana. And the two of them were deep in a conversation that was going to go on for a while, so she stood with Frank Delacroix at the fence and they looked out at the south pasture together. Can I ask you something? He said. Sure. When you took those eggs, when you loaded them into your truck that day at the hatchery, did you know any of this was going to happen? The research angle, the committee, He gestured vaguely at the scope of what he meant. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I took them because I needed something and they were there and everyone else had given up on them. The rest of it, she paused. The rest of it turned out to be what those birds were already capable of doing. I just had to get them to the ground. He nodded. He looked at the flock in the distance. My wife said something when I told her I was coming out here, he said. She said it sounded like you'd found something that had been waiting to be found. Claire looked at the bronze-feathered birds moving through the recovering pasture, doing what they'd been doing for centuries before someone decided they were inefficient, and she thought about her grandmother walking through tall grass with a flock of turkeys at her heels and knowing, in the way of people who pay close attention to land, exactly what those birds were worth. Tell your wife she's not wrong, she said. The January committee meeting happened in the back room of Nora Kessel's feed supply, because it was the largest available space that wasn't a bar or a church, and because Nora had offered it with the particular generosity of someone who understood that what was being built deserved a decent room to be built in. Claire had expected maybe 8 people. 23 showed up. She stood at the front of the room with a legal pad and a pen and looked at the folding chairs that Nora had set out, 16 of them, which had seemed like enough, and at the people standing along the walls and leaning in the doorway, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, The particular, slightly vertiginous sensation of a thing being larger than you planned for. There were faces she knew. Frank Delacroix and his sons, Gerald Pruitt, who had come alone without Brett and sat in the second row with his hat in his lap, Hector Barrientos from the butcher shop, Dr. Sokolov, who had driven 2 hours from the university and was taking notes before the meeting even started. There were faces she half knew, neighboring ranchers, a woman who ran a small orchard operation on the north side of the county, a younger couple she'd seen at the co-op but couldn't name, and there were faces she didn't know at all. People who had driven from the far edges of Garrison County, and one man who introduced himself as coming from over the state line in Wyoming because someone had forwarded him the Facebook post with Dr. Sokolov's preliminary findings, and he wanted to understand what was happening here. Elias, sitting at the back with his notebook open, caught her eye and raised his eyebrows in an expression that said, clearly, "You're going to need more chairs." She started the meeting 12 minutes late, after Nora had dragged in 3 more folding tables from the storage room, and people had rearranged themselves into something that resembled order. "I'm Claire Whitlock," she said. 8 months ago I took 320 turkey eggs that were headed for a landfill. 237 of them hatched. They've been working my south pasture since October, and they've cut my grasshopper density by somewhere between 40 and 60% depending on the section, which is better than 4 years of chemical controls did for my neighbor. She paused. She looked around the room. "I'm not here to sell you on anything. I'm here because this works, and I think most of you drove here today because you already know something isn't working on your land, and you're looking for a different answer. So let's talk about what we can build together and what it actually takes to do it right." She'd been nervous about the meeting for a week. The nervousness left her approximately 30 seconds in, because the room was paying attention in the way that only happens when people recognize that someone is telling them something true. She talked for 40 minutes. Then she opened it for questions, and the questions went on for another hour and a half. And by the time they finished, it was past 9 o'clock, and Nora had made 2 pots of coffee and a plate of something she called bars that were dense and sweet and disappeared in 20 minutes. The committee structure got agreed to. 5 farms in the first cohort for the surplus egg program, the Whitlock operation as the anchor, Frank Delacroix's property, a sheep and goat operation run by a woman named Bet Sorensen, whose land had been fighting the same grasshopper cascade Claire had faced, and 2 smaller properties whose owners, a retired teacher named Walt Greer and a young woman named Amber Chu, who had taken over her family's failing vegetable farm, were newer to livestock but had the infrastructure and, as Claire judged it, the temperament to manage incubation. The Wyoming man, his name was Roy Espinoza, and he ran 400 acres of high plains pasture on the other side of the border, sat through the whole meeting, and at the end came to Claire and said he wasn't in a position to join the committee formally, but he wanted to know everything she was willing to share about the methodology. "It's going to be in a published paper," she said, "next fall if the university's timeline holds." "I can't wait that long," he said. He had the direct, slightly worn look of a man whose land was in trouble and who was past the point of being patient about it. "I've got a grasshopper situation that's going to cost me more this year than I can absorb. I need to start this spring." She looked at him. "Where are you getting your eggs?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." "There's a hatchery in your county?" 2. Talk to them about surplus. Tell them what you're doing and why. They've been throwing those eggs away for years. If you frame it right, they'll say yes because it costs them nothing and it makes them look good. She paused. "And if they say no, call me. I'll talk to them." He looked at her for a moment. "Why would you do that? I'm not in your program. I'm not even in your state." She considered the question. It was a fair one. She thought about Dale Richter saying they're garbage, and Brett Pruitt saying you could just sell us the land, and all the quiet, accumulated weight of being told that the things she believed in were not worth believing in. "Because the grasshoppers don't stop at the state line," she said, "and neither should the fix." Roy Espinoza looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a card and handed it to her. A plain card, name and number, no logo. The kind of card a practical person uses when they don't want to spend money on design. "Call me when the paper comes out," he said. "Or before, if you're willing." "I'll be in touch," she said. Well, winter passed the way. Winters passed on the high plains, slowly, with cold that had opinions and Wayne that didn't negotiate. The hens rode it out in the barn on the east side, in the section she'd winterized with additional insulation and deep bedding, and they were louder than she'd expected and harder on the bedding than she'd planned, and one of them developed a respiratory issue in February that cost her 2 vet calls and a week of anxiety before it resolved on its own. Elias moved into the spare room in the house in January because driving back and forth to his apartment in Garrison twice a day made less sense than just being there, and because the spare room had been empty since their mother died, and it was time for it to not be empty anymore. He didn't say that second part. He said the drive was inefficient and gas was expensive. She said that was fine, and made up the bed with clean sheets, and didn't push on the other thing, because the Whitlock approach to emotional truth was to act on it first and acknowledge it quietly later, or sometimes never, and that had always been sufficient. Having him in the house was different than she'd expected. Better, mostly. He cooked on the night she was too tired to think about food, which was most nights, and he had the useful habit of fixing small things without being asked. A door hinge that had been squeaking since fall, a faucet washer in the kitchen, the section of fence near the east gate that she'd been planning to properly repair since October. He also watched too much television at a volume that was slightly higher than she would have chosen, and he had opinions about coffee that she found excessive, but these were manageable. "You're nesting," she told him in February, when she came inside to find he'd reorganized the kitchen cabinets. "I'm optimizing workflow," he said. "You moved the mugs." The mugs were on the wrong side of the coffee maker, ergonomically. Elias. Claire. She looked at the mugs in their new location. She got one out. She made coffee. The mug was, marginally, easier to reach from the coffee maker. She didn't say anything about that, but she also didn't move them back. But spring came in March, tentative and cold, and with it the first setting cycle for the surplus egg program. Richter came through with the eggs, 112 total across the 5 participating farms, more than he'd committed to, which she took as a sign that the board meeting had gone better than he'd let on. He delivered them personally, driving out to each farm in his hatchery truck, which was also more than she'd expected from him, and which she filed away as evidence that Dale Richter was a man who responded to being treated like a partner by attempting, imperfectly, to act like one. Her own allocation was 30 eggs, intentionally small. She had a functioning breeding flock now, and didn't need the volume, and she wanted the surplus to go to the farms that needed it more. Her 30 were set in the dairy barn on the second Tuesday of March, in the same sections where the first batch had sat, under the same heaters she'd upgraded in September, with the same careful temperature logs Elias had been keeping since August. She still turned them by hand. She'd looked at automatic turners in a catalog and decided against them, not on cost grounds, but because turning them herself meant she was in the barn 3 times a day, which meant she was paying attention in the way that made problems small before they became large. Automation would save her time. The time she spent in that barn was not time she wanted to save. Betta Sorensen called her on day 6 of the first program cohort's setting cycle in a mild panic about humidity readings. "It keeps dropping below 50, Bet said. "I've got 2 pans of water in there and a wet towel over the vent, and it's still not holding." "How big is the room?" "It's my old mud room, about 12 by 14. "You need more evaporative surface. Get a shallow baking pan, the big kind, roasting pan size, and set it directly on the heat source, and seal the gap under the door. Even a rolled-up towel against the bottom will help." A pause. "That's it? Try it tonight and call me in the morning." Bet called in the morning and her humidity was holding at 53. "I felt like an idiot," she said. "You're not an idiot. It's a damp towel and a roasting pan. Nobody publishes that in the manual." "Where did you learn it?" 3 in the morning on day 1, reading everything I could find on my phone and panicking quietly. Bet laughed. It was a short, slightly surprised sound, the laugh of someone who had expected competence and found humanity instead, and who found humanity more reassuring. "I'll call you if anything else comes up," Bet said. "Call me whenever," Claire said, and meant it. She ended up being on the phone with one or another of the cohort farms almost every day through the 6-week combined incubation and brooding period. Walt Greer had a hen go broody and try to adopt a group of poults, which was not the problem it sounded like, and actually worked out fine. Amber Chew's temperature probe failed on day 12, and she drove to 3 hardware stores at 10 at night before she found a replacement, and she called Claire from the hardware store parking lot in a controlled panic that Claire talked her through in 12 minutes. Frank Delacroix's older son Marcus turned out to be a natural. His section came in at 71% hatch rate, which was not quite Claire's 74 but was well within range for ideal conditions, and substantially better than ideal conditions for surplus eggs. When the final numbers came in from all 5 farms in late April, she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and added them up. Combined hatch from the first program cohort, 341 birds, from a starting allocation of 408 eggs. An overall hatch rate of 69% across 5 different operations, 5 different setups, 5 different levels of experience. 69% from discarded surplus eggs that had been going to waste every season for years. She looked at that number for a long time. Then she called Dr. Sokoloff. 341, she said. Dr. Sokoloff was quiet for a moment. Across 5 farms. 69% aggregate hatch rate. Claire. A pause. That's going in the paper. I figured. That's going in the abstract. Okay. Do you understand what that number means from a conservation standpoint? Heritage bronze turkey population in this region has been declining for 40 years. Dr. Sokoloff stopped. Claire could hear her composing herself. It was unusual. Dr. Sokoloff was not a woman who regularly needed to compose herself. You just added 341 heritage birds to the regional population in one spring cycle, from waste eggs. If the program scales to 20 farms, let's get the paper published first, Claire said. Then we'll talk about 20 farms. You're frustratingly cautious for someone who hatched 200 turkeys in a dairy barn. Cautious is how I got here, Claire said. Careful is how I stay. The paper came out in September. Dr. Sokoloff had been accurate about the timeline, which Claire had not entirely believed possible for academic publishing, which she understood to operate on a schedule roughly analogous to geological time. But it came out in September in a peer-reviewed Sustainable Agriculture journal, and it was co-authored by Dr. Mara Sokoloff, Patrick Weston, and Claire A. Whitlock, and the title was something long and technical that Claire didn't love but understood was necessary for the audience it was meant to reach. The soil data was the thing that got attention. The Whitlock South pasture, 12 months after the initial turkey integration, showed a 38% reduction in surface compaction, a measurable increase in organic matter content, and a grasshopper population that was, by late summer sweep counts, down 62% from the baseline documented the previous August. The pasture grass coverage had increased by roughly a third. Claire's sheep, grazing on that section through the summer, had come in at the best weight gain numbers she'd recorded in 6 years. The paper also included the cohort data from the spring program, and a section on heritage breed conservation implications that Patrick had written and that Claire had reviewed and found, to her surprise, that she had opinions about, and that Patrick had incorporated them with the exact right language when she explained what she meant. She read the published version sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, coffee at her elbow, Elias across from her eating toast and pretending not to watch her face. "It's good," she said, after a while. "Yeah?" "It's accurate," she said, "which is more important than good." She turned a page. "They got the incubation data right. I was worried they were going to simplify the temperature log section, but they kept the detail." "Your name looks good at the top," Elias said. She looked up at him. "It's the middle, actually. Alphabetical." "Still," she looked back at the paper. She thought about Dale Richter with his clipboard saying, "Toss 'em," and the way the room had looked when she'd loaded those 320 cartons into her truck in the August heat, and nobody had offered to help. She thought about the $11 checking account balance and the cracked boots, and the truck with 214,000 miles on it. She didn't say any of that out loud. She just turned the page. The second thing that happened in September was that Brett Pruitt came to see her. He came alone, which was new. He came in a regular truck, not the good one with the ranch logo, which she noticed. He parked in the drive and he stood outside his truck for a moment before he walked up, which was also new. Brett Pruitt had always been the kind of person who moved with the presumption of welcome. She met him on the porch. "Brett?" she said. "Claire." He had his hat in his hands. That was the thing she noticed first. He was holding his hat instead of wearing it, and he was looking at her with an expression that didn't have the ease in it. She was used to seeing on his face, "I wanted to come by. I should have come sooner." She waited. "The Facebook comment," he said, "back in the fall. About turkeys and wishes." He pressed his lips together. "That was stupid. And it was small. And you didn't deserve it." She looked at him. He was 32 years old, and he looked younger standing there with his hat in his hands, and she thought about how it is with some people, that the version of themselves they show the world is so much more confident than the actual person inside, that the actual person almost never gets air, and when it does, it's jarring for everyone, including the person doing the showing. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "Dad's East section," he said. "I walked it last week. I've been helping him with the records." He stopped. He seemed to be working up to something. "The difference is, it's real. What you did. What those birds did. It's not what I thought it was." "What did you think it was?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were desperate," he said. "And I thought desperate people make bad decisions, and I thought this was going to end badly, and I thought—" He stopped again. "I think I wanted it to end badly, because it would have meant things were the way I thought they were." He looked at his hat. "That's not a flattering thing to say about yourself." "No," she said, "but it's an honest one." He looked up. "You want to see the south pasture?" she said. Something shifted in his face. "Yeah, I do." She walked him out. The hens were moving through the far section, 130 of them spread across the recovered grass in the long September afternoon light, and the difference between this pasture and what it had been 2 Septembers ago was visible even to an eye that didn't know what to look for, and Brett Pruitt knew enough to look for it. "The grass," he said. "Coverage is up 30-some%, she said. "Soil's working again." He crouched down the way Danny Delacroix had crouched, the way people did when they wanted to understand the ground. Put a finger in it, feel the texture, make it real. He dug a finger in and held it up and looked at it. "Loose," he said. "It was like concrete a year ago." He stood up. He looked at the flock. One of the hens near the fence had found something in the grass and was conducting her investigation with the absolute focus of an animal who understands that the world is full of things worth examining. 3 other birds immediately lost interest in what they'd been doing and came over to investigate whatever she'd found. "Turkeys are weird," Brett said. "They're curious," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled, not quite, but close. "My dad wants to expand the rotation next year. More of your hens on his east section, maybe the south too, if you're willing. He said to ask you directly, not to send me, but—" He shrugged. "I wanted to come myself." She looked at the flock. She thought about what she'd built here and how it had been built. In the dark, in the heat, turning eggs at 5 in the morning, losing some and keeping most, making the next decision before the last one had finished settling. Not because anyone told her she could. Not because the numbers were good at the start, because the alternative was letting go of something her grandfather had built and her father had kept and she had nearly lost. And that was not an option she'd been willing to accept. "Tell Gerald to call me," she said. "We'll work something out." Brett nodded. He looked out at the pasture one more time. "Claire," he said, and there was something in his voice that was working to find the right container for what it was trying to say. "What you did here. I'm not—" He stopped. He shook his head slightly. "I just wanted to say I see it. That's all." She looked at him. She could have said several things. She chose the simplest one. "That's enough," she said. The second spring cohort had 14 farms. Roy Espinoza joined from Wyoming, with eggs he'd sourced from a hatchery in his county that had taken 3 phone calls to persuade, and had ultimately agreed when Claire sent them the published paper with the hatch rate data highlighted. He got 60 eggs. 61% hatch rate on his first try, which he called to report at 7 in the morning on the day his last egg hatched, with a voice that was doing a specific kind of work to stay level. 37 birds, he said. "That's a start," she said. "I know." A pause. "My wife cried." "Mine almost did," she said, and then remembered she hadn't had the thought the right way. "I almost did," she said. "Same feeling." "Yeah," he said. "Same feeling." Amber Chew's second cohort came in at 77%, which was the best number in the program, and she called Claire and said, "I think I'm good at this," in the slightly stunned tone of someone who has discovered a competence they didn't know they had. "You're very good at this," Claire confirmed. "I want to expand." "Can I expand? I've got more barn space and I think I could handle double the eggs." "Write it up and bring it to the March committee meeting." "I'm already writing it," Amber said. "I wrote it last night. I've been writing it since my hatch rate came in." Claire laughed. "Bring it to the meeting." "Should I also bring something, like food, for the meeting?" "You don't have to bring—" "I'm bringing something," Amber said firmly. "I make a very good cornbread." The committee meetings had evolved into something she hadn't precisely designed but recognized as important. Part business, part collective problem solving, part the specific kind of gathering that happens when people who work alone most of the time find a reason to be in the same room together. Nora Kessel still offered the back room. The folding chairs had been supplemented by a donated table from Walt Greer and a coffee urn from Hector Barrientos that held twice as much as Nora's pots. People brought food, increasingly. It wasn't a rule. It had just become what happened. On 2 years out from the day she'd loaded 320 egg cartons into her truck in the August heat, Claire stood at the fence line of her south pasture on an October evening and did something she rarely let herself do. She looked at what was there instead of what was missing. The flock was self-sustaining now. Her breeding program, the hens she'd kept from the first hatch, bred to the best toms she'd raised through 2 seasons, had produced a second generation of birds that were, if anything, more vigorous than the first. The old breed's genetics, preserved in the eggs Dale Richter had been sending to the landfill year after year, were expressing themselves in animals that moved through her pastures with a vitality that the commercial breeds she'd seen at the hatchery couldn't approach. The south pasture was a different piece of land from the one that had been losing the fight 2 years ago. She had the data on it. Dr. Sokolov's team came out every spring with their soil cores and their sweep nets and their careful documentation, but she didn't need data to see it. She could see it the way her grandfather had been able to see the health of his land, in the color of the grass, and the way water moved across the surface after rain, and the weight of the sheep that grazed it. The sheep were heavier. She'd culled less aggressively this fall because more of the flock was worth keeping. Her vet bill was lower. Her hay costs were lower. The grasshopper pressure that had been destroying her for 2 seasons had been reduced to something manageable, not eliminated, because these were biological systems and biological systems don't eliminate anything. They balance, but reduced to a level where it was no longer the defining problem of her farm. The November payment had been made for 2 years running, not scraped together in desperation, but covered with margin and planned for in advance. The loan was down to a balance that was no longer terrifying. The farm was not saved in any dramatic single-moment sense. Farms don't work that way. What had happened was more ordinary and more durable than saving. She had found a way to make the land work with her instead of against her, and the land was responding, the way land does when it's given what it needs, with the slow, unglamorous, entirely reliable productivity of a thing that is healthy. Elias came out and stood beside her at the fence. He had a jacket on, which meant the temperature had dropped more than she'd noticed. He looked out at the flock in the evening light. "Dr. Sokolov's paper got cited," he said. "The second one." She texted. "Cited where?" "Some conservation biology journal. And apparently a policy group in Washington is looking at heritage breed programs." He paused. "She said your name is in the citation, both citations." She looked at the birds. They were settling into the roosting behavior they shifted into at dusk, moving from foraging mode to something more collected, the flock drawing slightly together. One of the older hens, a bird she recognized by a particular marking on her neck feathers, the one who had been consistently the most assertive forager in the south section, moved through the settling group with the unhurried authority of an animal that knew exactly where she was and what she was doing there. Claire had not named her. She had come very close, approximately 4 times, and each time she had successfully declined. "That's good," she said. "About the citation. I thought you'd be more excited." "I am excited," she said. "This is what excited looks like on me." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That day at the hatchery. What if you'd been 5 minutes later? What if Richter had already loaded those eggs onto the landfill truck? She had thought about this too, in the small hours of various nights, the narrow margin of timing that separated the thing that happened from the thing that almost happened instead. It was not a useful thing to dwell on, but it was human to think about it. Then they would have been gone, she said, and I would have come home and figured out something else. You don't know that. No, she said, but I know I would have tried. He looked at her. She looked at the flock. The farm would have been fine, he said, with the deliberate quality of someone who is checking whether they believe their own words as they say them. The farm would have been fine, she said, with less certainty than she would have liked, but with honesty, which was what the question deserved. What she didn't say, because she was a Whitlock, and Whitlocks didn't say certain things out loud, not because they didn't feel them, but because feeling them was sufficient, was that the farm being fine was not the whole of what had happened here. The farm being fine was the floor of it. Above the floor was the committee with its 14 farms and its second spring cohort, and Amber Chew's 77% hatch rate, and Roy Espinosa's voice doing its specific work to stay level at 7 in the morning. Above that was the soil data and the published paper and the citation in 2 journals and the policy group in Washington that was looking at a program that had started with a woman loading discarded egg cartons into a truck with cracked boots in August heat, while hatchery workers watched from the bay door and said nothing helpful. Above that was what she didn't have a precise word for, the thing that happens when an idea finds the people who were already ready for it, when a solution that had been waiting arrives in a form that nobody expected and turns out to be something that had been there all along, in the old breeds and the old practices and the old knowledge that had been dismissed as inefficient before anyone thought to ask what it had actually been doing. Her grandmother had known what it was doing. That was the thing. The knowledge hadn't been lost. It had just been waiting in the particular way that useful things wait when the world has decided it doesn't need them anymore. Stubborn and quiet and entirely intact, ready for the person who would eventually look at what everyone else had thrown away and decide it was worth hauling home. The last of the evening light moved across the pasture and the flock settled, and the Montana sky did the thing it did in October, going from blue to something deeper in the east, while the west held on to the color longer than seemed possible. She could hear the sheep in the north section and the particular sound the hens made as they stopped foraging, a lower, more conversational sound than their working noise, the sound of animals that had eaten well and were ready for dark. Elias said, "I'm going to start dinner." "I'll be in." He went. She stayed. She was not a sentimental woman, and she was not given to standing at fence lines thinking large thoughts about legacy or significance. She had a loan balance and a vet appointment for one of the older ewes next week, and a committee meeting in November to plan 4 and 14 farms worth of breeding records to start organizing before spring. She had work, but she let herself stand there for a few minutes more, in the October cold, watching the birds that should not exist settle into the recovering land that they were healing, and she allowed the full weight of it to be what it was. Not a triumph, not a vindication, not the satisfying conclusion to a lesson about perseverance, but something quieter and less shaped than any of those things. A farm that was still here. Land that was learning to work again. Birds that had been thrown away, living. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, what enough actually felt like when you stopped confusing it with more. Not the absence of wanting, but the presence of something real and durable and earned, solid under your feet, in the way of things built slowly from what you actually had, not what you wished you'd been given. She pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the light in the kitchen window. Behind her, the last of the flock settled, and the pasture went quiet, and the dark came in from the east the way it always did over that piece of Montana ground. Ordinary and indifferent and entirely unchanged by the human story that had played out beneath it, which was, she had always thought, exactly as it should be.